Hello and welcome. I am Exit Light and this is my channel. Welcome to part 4, the final part of this true and terrifying tale. If you haven't seen parts 1, 2, and 3, please go to my playlist so you can start at the beginning and get the full story. If you would please give this video a thumbs up, and if you'd like to be subscribed, please do so. All right, let's get into this. The Broadduses still had to figure out what to do with 657 Boulevard. Their lawsuit was pending, but seemed unlikely to succeed. Some states require sellers to disclose transient social conditions, like murders or possible hauntings. In a 1991 case involving an allegedly ghost-filled house, a New York court ruled that as a matter of law, the house is haunted, but New Jersey had no such regulations. And as a side note, I could be wrong, but I do believe that 1991 case is the subject of the new Conjuring movie about Ed and Lorraine Warren. Okay, moving along. A judge later dismissed the lawsuit. The Woodses, through their attorney, declined to comment for the press. Derek looked into renting the house to the Department of Veterans Affairs and also a company that runs halfway homes. Boy, that would have thrilled the Knott neighborhood, huh? In the spring of 2016, they put 657 back on the market, hoping that it might garner more interest given how many people had reacted to the story by saying that they would have ignored the letters and just moved in. The Broadduses held a well-attended open house, after which Derek and Maria spent hours researching every person who signed in and comparing their handwriting to the watchers. That was pretty smart. But each time a potential buyer expressed an interest and met with the Broadduses' lawyer to read the letters, they backed out. Derek is quoted as saying, "Some cocky guy from Staten Island said, 'Fuck it, I'm going to get a house at a discount.' And he reads the letters and we never hear from him again." Feeling as if they were out of options, the Broadduses' real estate lawyer proposed an idea. Sell the house to a developer who could tear it down and split the property into 2 sellable homes. They thought they could get $1 million for the lot. Subdivisions like this had become common in Westfield, much to the chagrin of many of the locals, and 657 was one of the neighborhood's largest lots. Even so, dividing it would require the Westfield Planning Board to grant an exception. The 2 smaller lots would be 67.4 and 67.6 feet wide, just shy of the mandated 70 feet. When the proposal was published, Westfield's Facebook lit up. Some expressed sympathy for the Broadduses, while others pointed out that real estate is a gamble. Another faction was convinced this was the culmination of a long con. Of this whole scam artist story, there ends up being nothing more disturbing than this move, a local woman said. A man who coached the Broadduses' son in football wrote, "They were in over their head from day one." The application was jarring for the neighbors, who had learned about the watcher from the lawsuit, and had always found it strange that the Broadduses didn't share more information, not seeming to understand they were following orders from the police and trying to protect their children. A typical Facebook conversation went like this. "Sounds like this whole watcher thing was a ploy. The owners are good people, not a ploy. Okay, I know nothing about them." When the planning board met to decide on the application in January of 2017, it had already devoted a 3-hour hearing on the issue. More than 100 residents showed up. One of them, who lived across the street and had a daughter in the same grade as one of the Broadduses girls, had retained a lawyer to fight the proposal. Here was a new suspect. Who but the watcher would go so far as to hire an attorney to preserve the house? After a quick discussion about a Wells Fargo branch that wanted to use brighter light bulbs than the town allowed, the room grew as tense as suburban planning board meetings ever get. James Forrest, The Broaddus' attorney explained that the 3-foot exemption was as narrow as the easel he was using to display a map of the neighborhood on. A map that happened to display several lots on the block that were also too small. The neighbors expressed concern that the plan might require knocking down trees and that the new homes would have aesthetically unpleasing front-facing garages. Forrest repeatedly threatened the halfway houses as a possible alternative. After the lawyers and a parade of neighbors stood to speak, Glenn Dumont from across the street said the proposal would spell the end of the 600 block of Boulevard as we know it. These people are so entitled and dramatic. A woman whose kids had been to the Broaddus' old home for a birthday party spoke on behalf of 9 neighbors and presented 657 Boulevard as Westfield's Alamo. Our neighborhoods are constantly under attack from turf, lights, parking decks, you name it, she said. If we can't make a stand on Boulevard, where can we? At one point, Abby Langford stood up to say, I spent almost 60 years looking at a magnificent, beautiful house, and she didn't want to be looking out at a driveway. The hearing lasted for 4 hours, during which there was hardly any discussion about the reason why the Broadduses had been driven to tear down their dream home in the first place. A neighbor, Tom Higgins, was quoted as saying, has anybody thought about whether or not this lunatic who did this has been apprehended? Tom also lived across the street. Everybody lives across the street from this house. Even so, Higgins pointed out that there was no guarantee that the watcher wouldn't send letters to the 2 new houses, and he argued that aesthetics should rule the day. Not safety, by the way. Putting up 2 houses there is going to stick out like an old client of mine in Texas told me. He was quoted as saying, it's going to stick out like a dog's balls. Classy. While some of the neighbors expressed compassion, their focus remained on what the Broadduses stood to gain financially and what they themselves would lose. At 11:30 p.m., the board unanimously rejected the proposal. Derek and Maria were distraught. Even if the plan had gone through, it would have only stopped their financial bleeding for a little bit. On top of the mortgage and the renovations, they had paid about $100,000 in Westfield property taxes, and the town denied the request for relief. They spent at least that much investigating the watcher and exploring ways to deal with the home, not to mention cleaning the gutters. The Broadduses recognized that 657 Boulevard was a beautiful house on a beautiful street that was worth maintaining, but were surprised their neighbors didn't see the uniqueness of the situation. This is my town, Maria is quoted as saying. I grew up here, I came back here, I chose to raise my kids here. You know what we've been through? You had the ability, 2.5 years into a nightmare, to make it a little better, and you have decided that this house is more important than we are. That's really how it felt. On top of all that, her dad had just passed away unexpectedly. Father Michael Saporito, the priest who had blessed the home, went to one of the planning board meetings, and he's quoted as saying that he was taken aback by how many people had come to him and said that they thought the whole thing was a hoax. He went on to say, I think the human element of the story was kind of lost on the neighbors. The watcher had expressed a desire to protect the boulevard from change, but instead it had been torn apart. Not long after the planning board's decision, the Broadduses got some good news finally. A family with grown children and 2 big dogs had agreed to rent 657 Boulevard. The renter told Star-Ledger that he wasn't worried about the watcher, though he also had a clause in the lease that let him out in case of another letter. 2 weeks later, Derek went to 657 to deal with squirrels that had taken up residence in the roof, and the renter handed him an envelope that had just arrived. And there was a message that read, "Violent winds and bitter cold, to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria." This letter, 2.5 years after the watcher appeared, came out of nowhere. It was dated February 13th, the day the Broadduses gave depositions in their lawsuit against the Woodses. "You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, idiots," the letter read. "Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and you are too scared to tell anyone. Good move." The letter was less stylish and more wrathful than the others, and it seemed the writer had been closely following the story. They had seen the media coverage. They wrote, "I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. They noticed Derek's investigations. I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions." And the attempt to tear down the house. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. Then the letter went on. "My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the watcher." The renter was mentioned. He was spooked, but he agreed to stay if the Broadduses installed cameras around the house, and the letter indicated revenge could come in many forms. They went on to list the ways. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycle crashes. Bones break. Maria was quoted as saying it was like we were back at the beginning. But it also meant that there was fresh evidence that might help with the investigation. So Derek took the letter to the police headquarters, where a detective looked at the neighborhood map, and he traced a circle around the house 300 yards in diameter, suggesting that the watcher must be somewhere in there. But Derek drew one much closer. He was quoted as saying, "In my view, it's one of 10 houses in the world." The Broadduses continued to press the case, but there still wasn't much for law enforcement to go on. And it was impossible now not to look up and down that street and see the watcher in everyone. People had all kinds of ideas of who it could be. Residents mentioned a teenager whose father had grown up around the corner, and a man who sometimes walked around the neighborhood playing a flute. An elderly couple behind the house had been there for 47 years, and it was them that Bill Woodward had seen sitting in a lawn chair looking at the Broadduses' house. One of their kids had married a man who grew up in, of all places, 657 Boulevard. But these were bits of information that could mean anything or nothing, depending on how hard you looked at them. The Broadduses sent new names to the investigators whenever they found something odd. But their greatest fear was that the watcher could be someone they never expected. One day last spring, Derek picked a reporter up and they drove past 657 Boulevard, which he and Maria had tried to avoid unless they had to pick up the tax bill. "It's all beautiful trees and beautiful houses, but I still feel anxious," Derek was quoted as saying. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, what would my life be like if this hadn't happened? We lost Christmas a couple of times. And you don't get that back. Christmas with a 5-year-old. The Broadduses no longer live in ever-present fear that the Watcher might strike at any moment, but they continue to deal with the lingering effects from those letters. They have a new tenant in 657, but their rent doesn't cover the mortgage. Their kids are teased at school, and the conspiratorial rumors persist. They try to avoid the people who spoke out against their planning board application or accuse them of being con artists, but suburban life makes that impossible. Derek says, I see these people on the soccer field at the train station, and my heart starts going like it did when I played hockey and I was about to get into a fight. When Maria found herself in a spin class at the YMCA with the head of the planning board, she went up afterwards and told him, you continue to hurt my family every day. Earlier that year, the planning board approved splitting a lot around the corner that required an even larger exception than the Broadduses. By now, most people in Westfield say that they rarely think of the Watcher. The real estate market is doing fine, and many were surprised to find out that the Broadduses were still dealing with the problem. In hindsight, Derek and Maria wonder if they should have sold the house early and at a loss, and that the house conjured up too much emotional pain for them to even consider moving in. They hope that a few years of running the place without incident will help them sell it. The prosecutor's office was continuing to investigate, but the Broadduses knew that it was unlikely that the Watcher would ever be caught, and that the legal punishment would be likely minimal, even if they were. The Watcher was also no longer the only person sending anonymous letters in Westfield. On Christmas Eve, several families received an envelope in their mailboxes. They'd been hand-delivered to the homes of people who had been the most vocal in criticizing the Broadduses online. One of them, who lived a few blocks down on the Boulevard, had written on Facebook, I wish we could go back to the days of tar and feathers. I have just the couple in mind. Another family who got the letters were quoted as saying, it was weirdly poetic, as the Watchers had been, and it accused the families of speculating inaccurately about the Broadduses. It included several stories about recent acts of domestic terrorism in which signs of brewing mental illness had gone unnoticed. The typed letters were signed, Friends of the Broaddus Family. This letter writer had been clearly infected not only with the Watcher's penchant for anonymous notes, but also a simmering resentment, one that had snaked its way through the Westfield neighborhood, making enemies out of neighbors. The people who received the letters didn't know who sent them, but the tone had a familiar ring, and a reporter asked Derek Broaddus if he had written them. He paused for a moment and admitted that he had. He said he wasn't proud of it and that he hadn't even told his wife. He said they were the only anonymous letters he'd ever written, but that he had felt driven to his wits' end, fed up with watching silently as people threw accusations at his family based on nothing. The Watcher had been obsessed with 657 Boulevard, and Derek in turn became obsessed with the Watcher. He's quoted as saying, it's like a cancer. We think about it every day. Derek showed a reporter the photo of the fourth letter. It was on his phone. It read, you are despised by the house, and the Watcher won. In 2019, the Watcher house finally sold for about $400,000 less than the Broadduses had originally paid for it. Thank you for coming to my channel. If you know people who are interested in true crime, disappearances, paranormal, please send them our way. Please give this video a thumbs up. Good night and sleep tight.